new LinkedIn Hiring Pro can't undo your last hire, the no-show. Who set you back because they didn't show up on day one, or day two, or ever again. And now your product launch is delayed because you're talking to alien abduction podcasters to track them down. But LinkedIn Hiring Pro can help make sure your next hire sticks. In fact, businesses who use LinkedIn are 24% less likely to reopen a role in the next 12 months. Hire right the first time with LinkedIn Hiring Pro. Post a free job today at linkedin.com/quality.
This summer, say I do.
I am marrying a stranger.
Like never before.
Am I crazy?
It's a whole new Married at First Sight on Peacock.
Thank God I woke up in love.
With new experts.
My name is Dr. Lisa.
My name is Paul Brunson.
More couples.
This could be the start of a very successful marriage.
And more surprises.
Or maybe not.
Everything is just not enough.
You're a little bit crazy.
I don't know what's gonna happen. I want my fairy tale ending.
Married at First Sight, now streaming. New episodes Thursdays, only on Peacock.
Hey there, quick reminder, we are still running the Grit System Game Jam, the first one ever, through August 25th. There are third-party commercial-friendly licenses for all of our games and for the Grit System itself. It's perfect if you have a cool adventure game idea you've been working on, or want to hack something weird and use a bunch of dice that generally aren't d20s, or hey, maybe you want to bring a d20 to Grit, whatever. Check out stillfleet.com/gamejam2026, bring your cool ideas by August 25th, and guest judges, not us, but guest judges will award prizes, including some modest cash prizes and the chance of getting a published zine. So please reach out with any questions. We're really excited to see what you do. Thanks so much.
Welcome to Why We Roll,
A tabletop role-playing game design podcast by the Stillfleet Studio.
We're your hosts, Chris Pickett, creator of the historical fantasy game Danse Macabre,
And Wythe Marschall, creator of the political sci-fi game Stillfleet.
Through the show, we hope to amplify new creative voices.
We chat with different indie TTRPG designers, talking through a range of questions that are pertinent to many designers, players, and GMs.
We hope to showcase fresh and even challenging ideas about what makes imagination-based games so powerful.
Before we introduce today's guest, a reminder. If you enjoy this episode, please consider supporting the show and all of our games over at patreon.com/Stillfleet.
Okay, let's find out why we roll.
Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Wythe Marschall, and I'm here with...
Oh, hey, what's up? It's Chris Pickett.
And we are Why We Roll, the tabletop game design podcast from Stillfleet Studio. So this is who we are. We're here to talk as ever about indie tabletop role-playing game design. That's the subject. And we have interviews with amazing designers who are making new, innovative, cool work. So continuing with that theme, we have today Laurence Phillips from Hardy Roach Games.
We'll never break from the theme.
We'll never break. And Laurence, you have a new game called Il Fantasma del Giallo, and we're excited to get into that. But also more broadly, just to hear about your work. And with that, Laurence, I don't know if you could sort of introduce yourself and tell us who you are. What is Hardy Roach?
Yeah, I can have a go. So I'm Laurence Phillips, and I've been various flavors of writer and game designer in both tabletop games and video games for like 8 or 9 years, I think at this point, 7 or 8 years, whatever. I've written in games media for like Games Master Magazine and PC Games N, and then I wrote in video games for, these are all mixed together really, but I wrote in video games for a couple of mobile games and then also Vampire Survivors, and I wrote in tabletop RPGs for the Spire supplement called Strata. I wrote a source book for Legacy Life Among the Ruins, and I've contributed to the Old World RPG and Hardwired Island, and written some one-page games. And now I'm doing my first kind of big solo project.
Wow, well, that's it's an impressive resume. It'd be cool to talk about some of your other work as well, in addition to obviously your big solo project, which we're here to kind of unpack and promote.
Happy to.
But I'd love to hear about some of your work for Spire. I mean, I'm familiar with Strata and some of those other games you mentioned. So I think, one way that we often follow up with just like, who are you, is asking the very simple question, but you could probably talk forever about this. How did you get into games? Like, what were some of the first experiences? You just named a bunch of games, so I assume those are some that you're interested in, but what sort of led you to playing games and then eventually designing them?
Well, so I'd say my first exposure with TTRPGs was at secondary school. I don't know what grade that would be, but it would be like I was like 12 or 13. And I had a group of friends where we were all into games, into Warhammer. And I remember they used to hang out, this group of ours used to hang out in like the bottom of the stairwell in the IT department, which is information technology. That's the computer classes.
It's the same here. Don't worry.
we would hang out at the bottom of the stairwell in this weird building where like student could just walk by and there was like a window that just showed you the bottom of the stairwell. So it was like a nerd zoo exhibit. You just like you walk up to the glass and tap on them and tap on it, and they shrink away. Now I'd say like I was vaguely aware of role playing games prior to that, but I think my first kind of proper exposure to it was borrowing D&D 3.5 edition from one of my friends, and then also, but that wasn't my first game. The first game that I joined was a game of Star Wars Saga Edition, the D20 Star Wars game, and my first character was like the most first character you could possibly have. He was like a super cool Rhodian sniper. He never talked. He never talked, and he's rude to everyone. And no one. I wrote a whole backstory for him that no one will ever know because they don't want to ask him. And
because nobody
cares about your backstory, guys.
Oh man. I love the first high school character as edgelord. It's pretty good. I mean, mine too. No judgments here. Just
yeah. Oh, 100%. I mean, I don't know that every version of like Elven Ranger or Elven Paladin or Elven who rides a flying griffin, but they're all like snipers who like smoke a cigarette and don't, even though I didn't smoke, and it's like don't want to talk to anyone and have exactly, traumatic backstory that no one will ever know or care about, has nothing to do with the plot. This is great. This is peak high school. Yeah.
This has something to do with my backstory. And that's it. That's all you get to say.
You'll have to ask me about that. Oh, okay. Anyway, moving on. Yeah, and then after that, very quickly, I ended up running my own games and my first few games were all Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition, which I still have a lot of affection for as a system. But and then from then on, like it was just that, and then until I got to university and I helped Minerva McJander run the tabletop club at our university because we went to the same uni. She now writes for Rowan Ruck and Deckard, and and ended up running the tabletop part of the RPG society there. Yeah, and then got increasingly hyper specific with reading indie games and stuff.
Very nice. I gotta say, I'm really surprised. I've never heard of somebody in the UK being into Warhammer. That comes as a shock to me.
Yeah.
No, it is funny. I mean, like Warhammer was a big part of my kind of early nerd education for sure. But it is funny speaking to folks like Laurie O'Connell or Kayla, at Ratwave, Kayla McQuarrie, folks like that, and just like how omnipresent Games Workshop really is for y'all. It's like an inescapable eclipse that you're just kind of constantly in the shadow of.
I guess so. I mean, it was particularly prominent because I grew up in a city called Bath in the West Country. And it had like an unusually huge Games Workshop. Like it was a massive like corner shop. It had a huge back room, and they had must have been at least a dozen, maybe more, full-size wargaming tables with like boxes of terrain and stuff. And they basically functioned as like a free weekend, like a just free club, anytime club. So like even during the weekday, there was sometimes people hanging out there and painting. There were painting tables set up. And at the weekend, it was full of like teenagers playing games. So that was like a lot of my social life as a teenager. But even then, I think it took a while for like, even though Games Workshop was like a strong presence on like the high street, it took a while for it to be like something that was like normal to do. Like, you know, the size of the Games Workshop means that it was a very regular occurrence that someone would just walk in and yell like "nerds" at us, and then or like tap on the glass, you know, and like pull faces. And
it's funny how similar. Like for me, I wasn't as huge a fan of the game itself, but it was the spaces were very similar in the U.S. I found in Atlanta, in suburban Atlanta, we would go. My little brother and I would go to these places, and there'd be older guys playing Warhammer, and it was very involved. And they had all the tables, and I wouldn't say they were particularly like super nice or welcoming, but looking back, they would never, like, no one ever really said anything mean or pushed us away. Like, it was a space for nerds to kind of look at that hobby, and it's very physical compared to D&D, which I always liked, which other than the books, I like books, there wasn't, I mean, we didn't have minis, it wasn't really about that, and I think it was interesting to sort of see fantasy at that scale, and it was really impressive, and I do think a lot of that has left an impact, even though I wasn't usually like fielding an army and pulling out a little red piece of plastic to see if my Space Marine could see the whatever off-brand alien, the Tyranids, right? I was going to say Zerg.
It's the Tyranids, and
the Tyrazergs.
The Xenonids. Yeah, the Xenonid Zergs.
Xenonids. Yes. These kinds of spaces are important to the hobby, and I wonder how that's evolved. I don't know that I would be the best person to say exactly what that looks like now, but thinking of like 20-sided store places I like here in Philly, like there are still places for sure.
Yeah. I was going to say too, like, I mean, you know, this is the internet discussion of the disappearance of third spaces as well. Like, I mean, that is a third space, you know, where it's free, specifically free to like go hang out and play. Cause I mean, a lot of the LGSs around me in North Texas, they're great. They're friendly, but you have to like pay a fee to enter, which does makes a big difference. Makes a really big difference.
Yeah. I mean, I know that space is definitely gone now in Bath, because like when I was, I don't know, maybe 17, 18, they moved the shop to like a broom cupboard that was down the road, because the person who owned the building like massively raised the rent, and head office were like, no. So they just moved. So now it's just like a tiny broom closet with like a couple of painting tables and a single demo table, right? Like a couple of demo tables. So yeah, I mean, I do think it's an interesting one, because like when you were talking about like, oh yeah, there's these old guys there and stuff. Let me tell you, like hanging out at Games Workshop like every weekend as a teenager gave me a thorough education in the domain of weird guys. Like, you know, they're not doing anything particularly bad. They're not, you know, they're not doing anything particularly bad. They're just being a bit weird. Like, you know, I look back on it, and like, for instance, there was like this guy who at the time he would have been about like early 30s, mid 30s, I guess.
Which felt
and he
ancient.
really seemed to like just being king shit of the 12-year-olds. Like, you know, just throwing his weight around and being all arrogant and like, and like I look back at him now.
You don't have line of sight.
Like, I look back at him now and I'm like, you know, what's wrong with you, man? Like, why were you doing this? Like, you know, this weird, like, this bloke with a like West Country accent. You know, right, lads, you got went out on the lash last night, guys. Oh yeah. Like, I remember I was very confused by him, because I remember there's like a little back area where people would eat lunch, because there was like a couple of sofas there, and a load of the like, you know, 13 to 16-year-olds were hanging out there. And also there was the 30-year-old guy who was called Lurch, by the way. Like, that was
no fucking way.
He was called Lurch. And yeah, Lurch was sat on the arm of the sofa, like right next to me. And he had his foot up on his right knee. So his knee was sticking in my face. And I was like, could you sit like this? And I like crossed my legs. And he went, oh, no, mate, because I've got balls. And I spent like genuinely years being like, I wonder what was wrong with him, that his like balls were so like swollen and painful that he couldn't cross his leg. And then like eventually realized, oh no, he's just being like a weird guy. Right?
He's just being a
toxic
dick.
Masculinity. Yeah.
It's just toxic masculinity. It's hilarious.
There's so many characters. This bizarre.
I will say, as much as it's so easy to make fun of weird guys in games, and they definitely exist and still exist. Although I do think the hobby's diversified quite a lot from the 90s, in my experience. But
luckily,
But I do think there's something interesting about intergenerational kind of teaching moments and learning, and how do you ever get into anything? Because a lot of this stuff is pretty esoteric. Obviously, again, there have been all kinds of thoughts, cool movements toward accessibility. Obviously, games have become rules lighter in the OSR and NSR to a degree. There's all kinds of movements to make games more appealing to a broader mass, which is great and fantastic, and including from the big guys. I mean, 5e was a lot more diverse looking and sort of easier to get into, I think, than some of the earlier editions. But I do think there's still something to be said for an adult who isn't weird, like isn't truly like dangerously criminally weird, but just, they're an oddball, but they like games, and they'll hang out with the kid and just like teach them the rules. I think that's a cool thing that, again, those third spaces kind of offered, right? Like,
I had 2 points about this, because I am being like jokingly derogative about this, but I do think there's value in this situation, right? Because the first thing is, like, I do think the level to which cross-generational interactions are stigmatized in the modern day is actually really damaging, right? There's an immediate assumption that any adult that might want to interact socially with a teenager is like a predator. And like, I'm not saying that's not a risk that needs to be accounted for. It absolutely does, but I do think it's kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater a bit. I think it helped kind of helped me learn some things, both what to do and what not to do in terms of interacting with adults, right? And also, I interacted with a lot of kind of strange people I didn't agree with on a lot of stuff, and I don't think that's an invaluable. I don't think that's an unvaluable experience, right? Like,
that's an extremely valuable experience. Yeah,
like, just being able to put up with it when someone says something really stupid.
Exactly, and it's valuable as an organizer.
Or defend yourself.
And those are third space things that you could get from a coffee shop. It doesn't have to be a game shop, but a game shop was a very particular one, because these games are complex and often take a long time. So they did give space for an older person, a younger person. Again, even as you say, the older person might have been 20 and I was 15, but it was like, oh, okay, hey, dude, I'll show you how this rule works in Warhammer or D&D or whatever. That is actually valuable. I do think the internet can replicate some of that, but again, the internet's weird. Of it doesn't. It's not exactly the same. So I definitely think it's a point, Laurence, that there's been a baby bathwater mix-up with maybe to some degree.
Yeah, I agree. I also I think a big difference between games as third spaces and like coffee shops or even parks or things like that is that you do have these more or less like narrow guidelines for how you're going to interact in the space, right? Like, you're getting together to play Magic, we're going to play Magic. We're getting together to play 40K, we're going to play 40K. And you have this kind of like, maybe not guidelines, that's not the right word, but a niche kind of like center that you can concentrate on and like really facilitate intergenerational or just like whatever, just diverse experiences in the store, because you have this thing to focus your attention on.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
it does. It does. I mean, it's a large way, I think, especially kind of a lot of my guy friends, we kind of need an excuse to see each other sometimes. Like, oh, we're getting together for a war game, and then we end up meeting up and just chatting for 4 hours, right?
That's such a good point, right? Is that a lot of these games function as tokens to authorize just kind of hangouts of various kinds. And again, you can do them online. I play games online all the time, but it is really nice to have, friends where you can meet up at the local store and just fucking kick it. And the game is basically incidental.
And like, people would show up just to paint, right? Like, I would show up with models and just sit at the painting table for 8 hours and chat to people,
Yeah. Or they'll show up for one game, but then they will be open to trying something new because it's there and it's a social space where there's actually other humans being chill and normal, and it's like, oh, okay, Dread might be fun, I'll sit down and play it, right? Why don't we turn to Laurence? So how did you go from you're playing Warhammer and whatever else you're playing to you're making games? Like, what were some of the ways that you got into sort of writing your own content?
I never liked running like adventure modules or even always using the rules as written. Like, I really liked RPGs as a kind of framework within which to direct creativity. So I just kind of got used to making new stuff and writing new stuff and not relying on, like, I wrote like a rule set for playing green skin characters in like Warhammer fantasy roleplay, right? And like that at the time, I don't know if maybe it does exist. I don't really keep up on their like extended stuff, but like at the time it didn't exist. And it was just a lot of fun to put it on the table and see it work or not work or whatever. And then, I think it kind of lay dormant for a little while, and then I kind of just finished uni, and my friend Mina asked on Facebook if there was anyone who'd like to make a pitch for a source book for Legacy: Life Among the Ruins, her Powered by the Apocalypse game. So I was like, yeah, all right. Like, I do this kind of creative stuff. Like, at that point, I'd like run I'd run like a lot of parlor LARP and stuff at university, and so I was kind of back in the headspace. So I pitched it, and then I wrote it, and that kind of got me back into it. And I wrote like a load of one pagers, and then it lay lay dormant for a while because I was working in video games for quite a while. But it's something I've always kind of been working on in the background. Like, I've got probably half a dozen different game concepts in different stages, including a couple of war games. Yeah, they're not all great, but they were fun activities.
Yeah, I was just posting a link. You can check out Lawrence's one-page games at hardyroachgames.itch.io.
I'd say if you're going to check out one of those, I'd say check out The Incident, which is like a very autobiographical game based on my experience, because I was in special school for like the ages like 7 to 12, 13. And I had a very familiar repeated experience of having to have like a conversation with an adult, like authority figure, about like something that had happened. Let's talk about the incident, right? And you almost always, they were very sympathetic, and they were just trying to talk it through and help, but it never stopped being horrible, right? So
Yeah.
I just wanted to write like a two-person one-pager about having a horrible conversation. And it was quite funny because I remember I posted it like on Reddit. Okay, I wrote it many, many years ago, but I posted it on Reddit, and someone was like, yeah, this looks good, but I don't get it. There's like no way to like have a good outcome. Like, how do you, like, is there no way to like, oh, it actually goes really well, and it was a really good conversation, it was very constructive? I'm like, no, it's not about, no, this is a negative experience.
Yeah, it's not. It's about being in a position where you don't have power and feeling dread over consequences, maybe for your actions, maybe not. No, I feel like even outside of a special school, like this is like reminding me of conversations I had as a teenager with my dad, where it's like, oh, we're having a sit down, we're having a come to Jesus moment, and it's not going to be fun.
Yeah, and part of what makes it specific to like my experience as an autistic youth is that you actually have to constantly fight in that game to stop from having like a meltdown, right? Which isn't necessarily the case with all young people. But like you got to desperately not turn the conversation about the incident into another incident, right?
Incident squared.
Well, it's cool, but that's also cool just thinking of your genealogy. I mean, you're doing one-page games, which is already like a great way to kind of break in and try things out, and drawing on your life experience and kind of drawing on deeper themes. One might argue things adjacent to kind of politics, like social themes, not just goblin slaying or pure secondary world fantasy in that sense. And it also, you're influenced by Powered by the Apocalypse, so you're playing around with some of the cool elements that to me were really, really, really formative as a game designer about the OSR, where I'd grown up playing D&D. Yeah. Obviously Warhammer, Magic were around, but it was that moment of discovering the story functions, the narrative powers and stuff. I was like, oh, I could totally, like this completely Venn diagrams with the story, the screenwriter, the novelist in me, right? The person who wants to like have stories with people who do stuff that isn't slaying goblins.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to, we hear that a lot on the show. And I don't know if just to segue, if you want to go from, where did you go from one pagers? It sounds like from there you kind of got into the industry as such a little bit, and we're writing more and more for other people. Is that more or less what happened?
Well, it started with writing for Mina. Like, my first published RPG work was the source book. It's called Primal Pathways. It's essentially Spore. Like, so Legacy, Life Among the Ruins, if you're familiar, it's a game where you guide both a character and a civilization through a post-apocalypse. So you kind of evolve the culture, and then you jump like generations, right? So or whatever. So you'll kind of jump forward in the cultural change, and you'll have a new character. It's a cool game, actually. I really like it. But I had the idea of like it would work really well for like Spore is a game that doesn't work at all but like it's not a bad idea at its core. And I thought this was a really good concept for Spore, where instead of evolving a culture, you're like literally evolving a species, right? You jump through its kind of like evolution. So it's taking the time scale of legacy from like generations to like millennia. It was a lot of fun to write. I'm sure I could do it like better now, but like yeah. And then like from then I was like, I actually really enjoy doing this, and maybe I can put out one pages and that might build my profile a bit. But at the time I had a lot of stuff going on, mental health stuff, yada yada, and I ended up prioritizing like other stuff anyway. But I think it was worth doing regardless.
Yeah, I love that idea of taking the legacy idea and Spore and kind of seeing what you could do to cross them. Again, I think that's really cool design thinking and smart way to kind of frame a game. And definitely, it's something we don't always talk about on the show. We've been talking about more this year, but building on kind of an existing thing you liked, as opposed to jumping into your own games or alongside, one pagers, right? But as opposed to like, I'm gonna launch my kind of writing career in TTRPGs with like a 300-page book. It's like, I'm going to work with some developed game that basically works already, and then on the side write some one-pagers, and those give you a lot of skills, I think, right, to kind of then approach, the longer form products. I don't know if you want to say more about that. Yeah, if you want to say more about some of your work, Laurence, leading up to Il Fantasma, or if we should transition to sort of what you are currently working on. Yeah.
Like mostly it's like, for 2 years of the last, 7 years or whatever, I was working on the video game Vampire Survivors. So that, it was relevant in some ways, but like, not directly. But like Il Fantasma, I had the idea in like 2019 or something. So it's been a long time in the works. So like, by all means, we can talk about it.
Starting us off with Il Fantasma, for folks who haven't seen it, crowdfunding is starting soon, if I'm correct. But yeah, for folks who haven't seen the pre-launch or anything like that, what is Il Fantasma del Giallo? I cannot speak Italian. That was Giallo. And then my follow-up question is, why Giallo?
What was the first question again?
Oh, just could you what's the elevator pitch? What is the game?
So the game is a magical realist thriller / horror game that plays with the fourth wall and kind of metatextual elements, in which each player they are playing an actor who, for reasons they can't recall, stuck in this strange European town that houses a new film studio. For whatever reason, they can't leave. Like if they try and drive out, the roads are closed. If they try and get the train out, there's a rail strike. If they try and walk, they get lost in the fog and end up back where they started. They can't leave, and they can't remember really what happened to them before this, other than just a vague outline of who they are and vaguely, what they did.
That's such a good setup. That's so fun.
And I can tell you, it's kind of half inspired by later. But so while they're here, they have a contract that they signed at some point to make just a series, one film after another, of violent thrillers / horror films for this studio. Except when they start filming, they enter the reality of the films, which is called the Yellow. And the Yellow is a dimension built of narrative. So nothing is real until it's been established, and everything that's true can be untrue again, right? So while you're in the Yellow, you could make a sincere confession that you intend for your character to mean utterly sincerely, and then developments in the plot determine that actually you were lying. And now that's true, right? Now that is the truth. And while you're in the Yellow, your actor blends with a second kind of temporary character called a role. And that's their character in the film. That's the character they're playing. And they're kind of blended together in their brains. And if that character dies or is a murderer or does horrible things, they come out of the Yellow again and they remember dying, they remember killing, but they're not physically hurt. And then you can use, sorry, I appreciate it's going on a bit. This is a bit more than an elevator pitch, more of an escalator pitch. When they're in the real world, they can use the little nuggets of narrative that they gained in the film world and use them to influence reality and to remember the bad things that they did in their past that have perhaps led them here.
That's awesome. I love the idea of film studio / town as
Yeah.
liminal space. Like it's reminding me a lot of like Silent Hill or From. I don't know if you've seen, that's an American TV show
I
where
haven't
like
seen From.
people get trapped in this town. When they try to drive out of it, they just like blink and they're suddenly driving back into the town, all that kind of stuff.
I haven't, but I will point out that American TV shows are functionally world TV shows.
That is very true.
That's
very
cultural hegemony for you. So, like every Brit has heard of Sesame Street and the Muppets, but how many Yanks have heard of Zippy and Bungle from Rainbow or Sooty and Sweep?
Mr. What's that one? Mr. Blinky?
Zippy? Mr. Zippy?
No, not I know Zippy. I'm thinking of Mr. Blinky. Is that another one? He's like the big,
Oh, yeah,
scary. You know what I
Yeah.
He's
The
terrifying.
bear. I'm very, very cross.
Well, I was gonna say, in terms of American cinema, it also makes me think. Well, and European cinema, especially the New Wave, it makes me think of the films of David Lynch and sort of the idea of being trapped in Burbank and Hollywood and being part of a production of which especially Inland Empire actually takes these themes and sort of myth further, but you didn't really choose it, but is it actually part of your? There's almost like a Jungian, like you're acting out something socially that ritually, and it's putting it in a very modern, and in this case very very American, very Californian context, but it feels very creepy, and it's sort of like, is Hollywood actually kind of a ritual system? It's like a bunch of producer witches kind of casting these spells on the world, which in some ways like is a fine way of understanding how it extracts, rents. And
yeah, you're kind of not wrong.
And then and going back to the New Wave too, it also feels like you're calling back to like Last Week at Marienbad and like these kinds of classic stories, just no exit, right? Stories of being trapped and reality having multiple valences where you can't really determine them. And I think that feels like something that in movies doesn't always hit because it's kind of like confusing, but as an RPG is fantastic for the reasons you cite, because you can lean into every single emotion. You can lean into like, yeah, I'm definitely not the killer. And then, 2 sessions later, oh no, dog, I was the killer the whole time. So that's so good. Yeah.
I didn't even know I was the killer.
like it's a zero prep mystery game. So not even the GM knows who the killer is. It's just determined semi-randomly, so even if you there's no evidence against you and you were in scenes with the killer like 4 times, you can still be found to be the killer because that's just how these films work, right? They're not logical films, they're emotional films, right? And a lot, when I've talked to people, they'll sometimes say something like, why are you making a Giallo RPG? And I'm like, well, I am making a Giallo RPG, but that's one of 3 things that it's like influenced by, and it's not the big. It's not even the majority of it. It's like even portions, right? Like if I had to name like 3 major influences, they'd be Giallo as a film genre, they'd be the Twilight Zone, and they'd be the works of David Lynch, particularly Mulholland Drive and Inland Empire.
There you go.
Yeah, I started making a Giallo game 6 years ago or whatever, and I didn't get far enough with it because the problem is, and I think this is a problem common to a lot of RPGs that aim to emulate horror film, is that people personalize a lot in most RPGs, right? Like they have a character, but they are talking as the character, the way they talk, the way they act, the way they make decisions. They are still think that they are themselves as well. And that means that sometimes you get players who won't do the stupid thing that a character in a horror movie would do, that a person in real life might do, because they're too genre savvy and they're too in that zone. And I wanted to find a way to avoid that, and to also find a way to have the players be the killers, to have them get killed off and come back, to have them, be traumatized over and over again. And I was like, I need a second layer to this. And that's where like the metatextual level of it kind of came in. The other thing is like, I always need to define my terms, because someone who reads too much film academia essays and stuff, when I say Giallo, I've had people go like, oh yeah, I love Suspiria, and I'm like, no, I don't consider Giallo I don't consider Suspiria Giallo at all.
That's psychedelic supernatural at
Like,
best.
it's not synonymous with horror even. Like, a giallo film can be a thriller or like a Hitchcockian tension film, and indeed a lot of the ones in the '60s are, right? Like, films like One on Top of the Other and Orgasmo, they're not horror films, they're more like, tense.
Yeah, they're like the B movies of Vincent Price, or going all the way back to the Grand Guignol in France. I mean, I think that's the tradition of kind of spectacle. They're spectacles, which sometimes is horrific, and especially body horrific, or sort of attendant to like slasher, but not really coming from the same 70s, 80s American.
There's also the crossover 60s, 70s, and 80s with oh man, I just forgot the term I was looking for. Anyway, go ahead.
Neorealism?
Neorealism, yes, but just exploitation films as well.
Yeah.
Like you see that creep into it, and I feel like that's like in my mind, that's a defining feature of giallo as well. Is like, yes, thriller, psychological horror, but there is an element of exploitation, whether it's sexploitation or violence,
Absolutely,
whatever.
absolutely. But really, giallo are kind of proto slasher films. Like, they predate slasher films. But I've talked about this actually elsewhere. But it's something I think is important when it comes to the kind of thematic meat of the game, which is the giallo, like the more murderous giallo, like Blood and Black Lace and Deep Red and Bird with Crystal Plumage. They do share like they are kind of like progenitors of slasher films that directly inspired later slasher films. But they are very different, and one of the big differences I give is murderous giallo films come from a very different film tradition. They come from a post-war European film tradition that was influenced by things like neorealism and the white phone era of Italian cinema in the 30s, and fascist cinema in the 30s and 40s. They've had this very polished and false era of like aesthetics in filmmaking. And then after the war, the kind of trauma that people felt and the devastation of the landscape was a large reason why neorealism became a thing, because it became there was this appetite to reject this falsity, right? And there was this kind of postmodernist nihilism. But America didn't go through that in quite the same way. So slashers are like moralistic to their bones. They're not humanistic. They're about like evil. Like, even if they're about humans, like Michael Myers is pure evil, right? He's not human, even though he is.
Sure. Or even Scream, I think, is a good example where,
Yeah.
they're referencing horror movies, but that is just, it's still a moral tale at the end of the day.
Right.
Yeah, they're very Christian. They're very Protestant. They're basically slasher movies in the U.S. tradition and the 70s, 80s tradition are and then Scream, right, is the 90s kind of meta version. But they're all just like slut shaming all the way down, right? That's kind of what the movies are about. Whereas I think giallo, like say going back to the Grand Guignol and Artaud and the theater of the absurd is about the idea of the Grand Guignol was
Right.
people are big puppets. They're
Yes.
not really realist in a sense. They're standing in and they're creating an emotion, a spectacle. So the goal is the gross out spectacle. And turn of the fin de siècle France, that was like a big thing that was a revelation, because other theaters were either kind of spectacles in an operatic tradition in a different kind of mode that wasn't tied to like modern life, like trains and like people dying and sort of the gross out horror stories that would eventually become sort of slashers. And I think that there's a sort of level of fun having with that like big puppet thing that fits well with RPGs, whereas slasher movies, it's one reason why I don't watch as many, don't play as many. I know, Chris, you are a huge horror movie buff, but to me there is a kind of moralizing to the realism that I find a little weird, and I like giallo more because it feels a little more dreamy and kind of like you mentioned, liking David Lynch, it feels closer to that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that they are dreamy, but they're also grounded in some really interesting ways, because something that's interesting in the giallo genre is that, for however problematically they generally handle the subject matter, because they generally do, people become killers not because they are like evil in their core. It's usually because of how systems and experiences have made them traumatized and thus made them like go crazy and kill people, right? Now, obviously in real life, this is not accurate. Like, people who are mentally ill are less likely to hurt people, right? But like, but it has like on a thematic level, it has a metaphorical truth to it, which is if we look at this, like the losing this mental break from reality, less as a literal thing and more as a metaphor for breaking out of like societal morality as like a thing and being juddered out of it, broken out of it by horrors, by horrible experiences. There's something humanistic about this, even if it isn't positive. Like it's simultaneously pessimistic and yet like incredibly very much engaging with the idea that people are a product rather than like an innate thing.
Yes. Alienation under
I think
capitalism.
that's a great point.
Well, and also like, whatever Baudrillard's whole the body is the last frontier of capitalism, I think kind of comes to mind for me too. Or yeah, I mean, it people become products. We become commodities in and of themselves.
It's also Return of the Repressed if there is room for a truly supernatural explanation, and even a supernatural explanation that's kind of sublimated into this social moment. Like it's these movies aren't as concerned with like skeletons and zombies and vampires as the like the Vincent Price movies, but I think there's something about, to your point about the social, where the characters can be very stock tropey, cartoony, because the reason they're a killer is actually a social reason that is going back to a pre-capitalistic kind of folkloric register. The reason the vampires are scary, werewolves are scary, these are like old ways of talking about fears that humans share and fears for society that capitalism tries to make money out of but can't really get rid of. So the fears keep coming back, and we talk, the xenomorph is the ultimate vampire of our time, right? But I think it's fun to think about these movies because they're not they're a little flatter and not as realistic, quote unquote, as the American slasher movies. They're allowed to have a real supernatural theme that stands in for something social in a way that I think in the US ones it doesn't really make it. Like there's either never really any supernatural, or the explanation makes no sense and isn't a metaphor for anything. It's just a guy can't die. It's a big guy who can't die stabbing you with a knife. It's not really about anything, I
don't agree. I don't agree that they're less realistic, actually. I think the opposite is true. Like, especially the Giallo of the 60s, right? Like, you watch like like one on top of the other is one that I mentioned. Like, it's very stylized, but it is like quite gritty. It's engaging with especially post-war decay. Like, especially in the 70s, you get a lot like the House with the Laughing Windows really engages with this idea of like and Short Night of Glass Dolls as well. Really engages with the idea of like post-war, like both like using infrastructural decay as synecdoche for like moral and political decay. And like the breakdown of traditional structures, right?
Yeah. No, that's right. And I should say, I don't mean I guess I meant the grit is interesting and seems more vivid to me. And maybe it's because I'm not European and was not growing up, as you say, in the shadows of this kind of reconstruction after World War II that's still kind of happening by the 70s. Whereas I feel like the US movies, they're this like, it's like they match with the end of history, right? All the slasher movies are like, it's the suburbs, everything's chill, there's no real social threats. And so the threat is this like completely constructed seeming just like a crazy guy who is just running around stabbing people. I don't really know. We should talk about your game, but I think it's interesting, Laurence, that you thought clearly deeply. The reason why I wanted to say it is just you thought deeply about these things, and it's going to come through at the level of the game. So let's turn more to like how the game works, because I think it sounds really fun for one, I will say.
Yeah. How do you mechanicalize and mobilize some of the stuff we've been talking about through the course of the game?
How to describe. So I'll start with like the kind of how you kind of go through a film, and then we talk about how you resolve like conflicts and stuff. So when you like the real world operates a little bit more like a traditional TTRPG experience. It's less structured. But in the yellow, there's a structure. So you have a GM who's called the director, and the director is supposed to they function more as a mediator than a traditional GM. They're there to set the pace of films and make sure that a decision is made, right? So that like four players aren't arguing for ages over whether like the curtains are blue or red, right? Like he's just like they're fucking blue, to quote a post I hate, and you move on. The way you do that, the process is the players taken in turns to draft a scene. So the game uses playing cards at every stage of its randomization. Every player has their own deck, and the GM has a deck as well. And the GM will draw them 3 cards from the deck. You correspond what cards you've drawn to like a table, which has like a table of prompts that are very loose. They're just kind of guidelines. And the player who drafted it then comes up with like an idea for like what the the scene is. Oh, and you'll also have discussed either collaboratively or that maybe the GM just decided what the basic premise for the film is. And players would have generated their roles that their actors are playing in the film. So other than like the premise and your like characters in the film, like nothing else is decided, right? So then you kind of everything can be collaborative. Like at every stage, you can discuss options and choices. But if the director can basically be like, "We're going with this. Let's move on." So you move through the scene as you interact with people and you resolve conflicts. You gather evidence, which is in the form of leads, clues, truths. And each one of these is like a more solid form of reality, basically. Like lead is very vague and you can essentially twist it towards anything. A clue, there's like a core of truth here, but it's not like a lot of stuff around it can be recontextualized. A truth has a thing about it that can't change. You can maybe change some of the context. So for instance, a lead might be that character sounded kind of bitter when he mentioned his wife, right? That's a lead. A clue might be that character took out an insurance policy on his wife, right? And a truth might be that character shot his wife, like someone saw him do it, right? Now, even that isn't like a permanent implication against that character, because more investigation can twist that truth to be like, yes, he shot his wife, but someone had a gun on him behind him and you couldn't see them behind like a thing. So now it implicates someone else, right? So it's like you're playing with this idea of like the reality is malleable, but evidence is essentially a resource that makes little parts of reality less and less malleable as you develop it, right? And then those become truths become a resource in the real world as well, but I won't get too in the weeds. So you continue with the film. There'll be guidance in the full book on like how to like structure your films, but generally a film is likely to take, probably 2 or 3 sessions. You can do it in one, but it might be a bit rushed. And then at the end of it, you determine who the killer was, and you can play, however much, at some point in the third act, you determine who the killer was. It might be the last scene, it might be like, in the last half an hour. And then once you know who the killer is, you backfill. Essentially, you take the evidence that you've gathered and you make it make sense, because and a lot of it won't completely make sense.
That's so funny. Yeah, the recontextualization is so funny.
Because in these films, it often doesn't make sense. It's like, oh, like this character killed someone, even though like in the last scene they were like on the other side of town doing something else. There's no way they could have crossed that. It doesn't matter, because like something I say in the book is that this isn't like an intellectual murder mystery where all the pieces are there and you can work it out. It's an emotional roller coaster. It's using mystery as a structure to make you feel upset or excited or shocked or emotional or unsure or tense. Like it's a vehicle. But yeah, so on a scene by scene level, in terms of complex, you resolve conflicts by when something happens where 2 or more people want different conflicting things to happen, you have a conflict. And the way that works is you play bidding. You play these bidding rounds that are like a trick-taking system. So the person who started the conflict makes a bid. They say, you set the stakes of the conflict, like here's what we're doing, here's where we are, here's the threat level. And then you play a bid and say, here's what I do. And you don't just have control over, actually, it's not just what I do, here's what happens. Like you can actually influence, you can dictate for other people, provided that you all agree on like where you're going. I'm trying to play with the lines of player GM autonomy here, where players have like more power over what the GM might traditionally have power over in some games, but they also have more power over what other players are doing than they might in other games, which is an interesting topic that I won't go into right now. But anyway, so person plays a bid, they say what happens. The other person plays a counter bid. If it's lower, then they describe what they do to get the upper hand in this exchange. And if it's higher, then they describe how they lose the upper hand. And at this point, they can either raise the stakes of the conflict, make it more dangerous, but get more cards, because they draw cards based on the stats relevant. they can keep going at the current kind of level of threat, but they don't get more cards, or they can like relent and give up. But every time a bidding round happens, that pile where bids go builds up, and whoever ends up relenting takes the pile as trauma, which is like the closest thing this game has to like damage, although it's, you know, it's both a plus and a minus in a wider sense. So when you have more trauma, you're more likely to be killed. You're more likely to be harassed by the killer and more likely to be killed. And this is so even if you actually just spend the whole film arguing with characters, if you keep losing arguments, it puts like a dramatic pressure on your character, right? So like you're building up trauma even if they're not getting hurt. And it means that I can recreate that experience of a film where someone goes completely unharmed the whole movie and then just dies. Right? Yeah, so that's the kind of main resolution system.
Yeah, that's brilliant. We were just remarking in the chat. I mean, I think it's fun how you've taken tropes from cinema and repackaged or used them as inspiration for RPG play. And to your point, it sounds like you've thought a lot about who is doing what aspect and how that corresponds both to traditional sort of GM player information gaps and who gets to sort of direct the scene in the sort of broadly, you know, the Gygaxian tradition that the GM is the director in that sense, versus, you know, in a lot of story games it's like more collaborative or floats around, there is no GM, whatever. And here it sounds like you're playing with those things as well as kind of really coming from cinema, what people do or don't know when you're shooting. It almost makes me think of like you hear these legends in Hollywood of people who just have no idea. They don't read the script. Like A-listers don't read a script. They show up, they say some lines, they walk away. They don't really know how it all fits together. And it's kind of funny to think about living like that being the structure of this dreamlike story where you can't figure it out ahead of time. You know, you have to play through it. Yeah.
Players are really actively engaged to engage with the narrative as filmmakers, not just as characters in this world, right? So rather than saying, I walk into the room, say, we cut to a shot of inside a room, the door opens, my character walks in, the camera zooms in on his face and the score swells up and the lighting does it, right? Like in playtesting, I always, like in playtesting and playtest material, I always try really hard to emphasize this because it adds to that depersonalization process that I was trying to do.